This is the source of the heavy metals found in a recent Belgian study about these peptides. They found inorganic arsenic, the carcinogenic form, at concentrations at up to 10 times the accepted safety limit for parenteral drugs. They found lead. These aren't trace environmental contaminants. These are residual chemicals from a dirty manufacturing process.
What's up and welcome to SEMAGLUTIDE Science, where you're joining me just over a decade into my personal journey of working to bridge the gap between metabolism, macros, muscle, and medicine, all while helping coaches scale the impact that they desire and deserve. If you are here, thank you so much for listening and for trusting me to help you elevate your coaching game or to lead you in your transformation to realize your true potential. In either case, each week I'll be sharing my methods, models, and message to serve as leverage for your specific goals. Without further ado, let's get on to today's show.
When independent researchers bought peptides from popular internet pharmacies, only 38% met basic purity standards. Simpler molecules did okay, which lulls people into trust. But as soon as you move into complex peptides, purity can drop off a cliff. Let's get into it. More and more people are sourcing peptides from the internet. Semaglutide, BPC 157, you name it, people are probably shopping for it. In the best case scenario, they've had these compounds prescribed from a compounding pharmacy, but at worst, they're buying them from unregulated research chemical websites, and then they may be asking you, if you're a health coach, for some type of guidance on these compounds. Today, we'll talk about the actual evidence from what happens when these online products are tested in a lab by independent researchers. Consider this your peptide research intelligence briefing, and we're going to walk through some key studies so you understand the tangible risks that customers are facing, often without their knowledge, so you can make the best decision for yourself. This is about giving you the information you need to make the choice, whether that's for yourself or if you're getting questions about this from your clients. So we don't want to be relying on hope and just marketing information instead of true informed consent, especially when it comes to these compounds. So before we get into the lab results, it's important to frame the problem. Why is this issue happening in the first place? The gray market for peptides isn't appearing in a vacuum. It's growing in the gap between immense public demand and slow and sometimes restrictive or expensive pharmaceutical access for these compounds. People hear about the transformative effects of a drug like GLP-1 on the news. They see it on social media, but then if they can't get a prescription or their insurance won't cover it, they're left to their own devices. Or maybe they simply don't want to go through the medical system. This creates a powerful demand curve. And where there is demand, a supply will always emerge to meet it. In this case, the supply is a sprawling global network of chemical synthesis labs and online storefronts. These sites use the language of science, touting 99% purity and other marketing terms, showing different chemical structures, and sometimes even providing a certificate analysis or COA. And this is the trump card for many of these sites. It looks like a legitimate lab report. There's graphs and percentages, and it seems to prove the quality of their product. But this is often a masterclass in deception. First, their certificate of analysis might actually be for an entirely different batch for that compound. A lab might produce one very pure batch, get that one tested, and then use the same certificate of analysis for months or even years, even during subsequent lower quality production of the same compound. Second, the testing parameters themselves can be manipulated. A lab can set their equipment to ignore impurities that fall outside of a certain molecular weight, effectively making them invisible on this report. Third, the COA might be completely fabricated. Without a clear chain of custody from a known testing lab, a COA is just a piece of paper, a marketing document, not a scientific guarantee. This is a critical piece of context for anyone who says, but the website has a lab report. So let's establish the baseline reality of this market beyond the actual marketing. A foundational study by Janvier and colleagues gave us the first comprehensive look under the hood of research peptides. They purchased peptides from several different research chemical companies, things like growth hormone secretagogues, melatonin 2, and even complex molecules like CJC1295 and different sermorelin analogues. Their top line finding is the one that sets the stage. Only 38% of the products they analyzed met minimum purity requirements. but the details are even more revealing. They found that simpler, more stable peptides like GHRP2 and even Melanotan were often quite pure, sometimes hitting the 97 to 99% mark, which is what you want. These are relatively small and robust molecules. They're cheaper and easier to synthesize correctly. The market is capable of producing these. This is a critical point of distinction because it creates a false sense of security around other compounds. A user might have a good experience with a relatively simple, clean peptide from a vendor, and then assume that same vendor's more complex, fragile peptides are of the same exact quality, which isn't the case. The data shows that this is a dangerous assumption. When researchers looked at more complex molecules, the results fell off a cliff. Oxytocin, a neurohormone with a critical disulfide bond, had purities measured at only 71 to 74% in 2 different samples. That means over a quarter of the material was not the intended hormone. For a molecule that acts directly on the brain, that level of impurity is deeply concerning. They also looked at human growth hormone releasing hormone analogues, also known as GHRH, the things like sermorelin and CJC1295. These are super popular in the anti-aging space and folks who want to boost their growth hormone. Now, the purity results here were a disaster, all over the map, with many falling well below 70% and some showing significant degradation into unknown substances. For someone who's trying to optimize their hormonal health, you could be just injecting a cocktail of molecules that's doing nothing, and you're wasting your hard-earned dollars, or worse, it may have unintended biological effects. When they looked at AOD9604, a peptide fragment marketed for fat loss, the results here were wildly inconsistent. One sample showed 45.9% purity, while another from a different vendor came in at just 4.8%. That's not just a bad batch, it's evidence of complete lack of process control. Containing only 4.8% of the active ingredient is not just functionally inert, it's super expensive powder that's adding nothing of value. The study established a core principle of the gray market: extreme variability and complete lack of quality control of certain peptides. You don't always know what you're getting, and the more complex the molecule, the higher the chance that you may just be buying expensive powder that's not doing much in your body. Now let's zoom in on the most relevant case study for today. There's one on SEMAGLUTIDE. This was a study published in 2024 in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, focused exclusively on this GLP-1 compound, and the results are staggering. The researchers purchased injectable semaglutide products from 3 different online vendors. So these are research chemical sites online that were publicly accessible, and the paper names a few. Now, the journal specifically names US Chem Labs, SEMASpace, and Biotech Peptides. All of these products were actually advertised as having 99% purity on their websites. When analyzed using proper analytical methods, the actual semaglutide content ranged from a low of just 7.7% to a high of 14.3%. Let me be clear, the vast majority of the material in the vial, in one case, over 92% of it, was a collection of unidentified low-mass compounds. It was not the drug as advertised. The researchers called for more advanced analysis and toxicological screening to even further figure out what these substances are. There's little known about what is truly in these vials. This is a case of a true mystery cocktail of solvents, reagents, and failed synthesis fragments. Furthermore, every single sample that these researchers tested independently did test positive for significant levels of endotoxins. These are inflammatory molecules from bacterial cell walls that are left behind from sloppy, low-quality manufacturing processes. The limits of endotoxins in injectable drugs are incredibly strict for a reason if you're going through an actual pharmacy, because injecting them bypasses the body's primary defenses and can provoke a systemic inflammatory response. So what does this actually mean in practice? Now, this could manifest as flu-like symptoms for one customer, fatigue, low-grade fever, or just a general feeling of being unwell. The customer might attribute this to the peptide kicking in or some other side effect from something like a GLP-1, when in reality, it's their immune system reacting to bacterial contamination. They feel sick because they are injecting a pro-inflammatory agent into their body. This brings us to the manufacturing process itself and how that impacts peptide safety. Why is this happening? It comes down to the complexity and cost of something called solid phase peptide synthesis, or SPPS. This is how these molecules are built, one amino acid at a time. During the process, chemists use protecting groups to make sure the amino acids link together in the right order. After the chain is built, all these protecting groups have to be perfectly cleaved off, and the final peptide has to be rigorously purified and separated from all the failed sequences and chemical debris. This purification step is expensive and time-consuming. It's the primary place where unregulated labs and research chemical sites cut corners. The gold standard for this process is called HPLC, or high performance liquid chromatography. It's a sophisticated method that separates molecules based on their chemical properties. Running HPLC properly requires expensive equipment, expensive solvents, and skilled technicians to execute the process. It's the single biggest bottleneck and cost center in producing a clean peptide. When labs skip or rush through this step, you can end up with a host of problems related to the product. You get deletion sequences, which we discussed earlier in the show. So a 27 amino acid chain sold as a 29 amino acid peptide. This is a direct result of the failure in the synthesis process. You get incomplete deprotection, where some of those chemical protecting groups are left stuck to the final peptide. These are chemical reagents that are not meant for human consumption or injection. And you get contamination from the catalysts used in synthesis. This is the source of the heavy metals found in a recent Belgian study about these peptides. They found inorganic arsenic, the carcinogenic form, at concentrations at up to 10 times the accepted safety limit for parenteral drugs. They found lead. These aren't trace environmental contaminants. These are residual chemicals from a dirty manufacturing process. Another hidden risk is aggregation. Peptides that are improperly synthesized or purified can clump together, forming aggregates. These clumps can be recognized by the immune system as a foreign threat, potentially triggering an immune response. This can lead to not only inflammation, but also the development of antibodies against the peptide itself. If a client develops antibodies to a gray market peptide, they may find a future legitimate pharmaceutical version of that drug to be less effective or completely ineffective because their own immune system is now primed to attack it. This is a long-term risk that is almost never discussed on forums or Reddit or Google searches when these products are promoted. This is the reality of chemistry. 99% purity that's claimed on these research chemical websites is a marketing number. The actual purity is a function of the manufacturer's willingness to spend time and money on rigorous purification and steps like HPLC. And in an unregulated market, that incentive is virtually non-existent. So what should you do with this information, or anyone who's interested in peptides? So whether you're a coach or in your own health journey navigating conversations about peptides, or you're just personally curious, you have to consider the fact that the data has to come first. Because if you're a health professional, and especially coaches, right? Your job is not to prescribe or forbid certain substances. You're just the source of ground truth data for the person that you're talking to. And if you're in your own health journey, you just want the right information to make the best choice for yourself and to stay healthy in the process of utilizing some of these compounds. A 2024 study on gray market semaglutide found purities were often below 15%. With all samples containing inflammatory contaminants. So that GLP-1 for weight loss, like maybe not the best idea if we're injecting contaminants in the body. Other studies have shown contamination with heavy metals like arsenic due to poor manufacturing quality, and that complex peptides are often sold with the wrong amino acid sequence, which can render them useless or actively harmful. We have to remember this. If you're someone personally considering this route, the same framework applies. Ask yourself, what do you actually know about the source? Not what the website claims to try to sell you the product, but what has an independent lab potentially verified? Ask yourself whether you can trace that certificate of analysis to a named third party, a testing facility with a clear batch number. Ask yourself what your plan is if you have a reaction, given that the contents of the vial are, by the evidence, largely unidentified. The common objection, whether it comes from a client that you're working with or maybe from your own internal reasoning, is probably something like this. But people are using these products online and buying things from research chemical sites, and some are getting great results. That could be true. Some simpler peptides from some vendors can be relatively pure. The problem is the lack of consistency. The next vial from the same site could be completely different in terms of the batch that you purchased compared to what your friend purchased, and the risk is not uniform. It shifts with every order, every batch, every compound, and every research site, and that unpredictability in itself is the problem. For coaches, it's also worth documenting these conversations. A simpler note in your client's file that you provided information on the documented purity and contamination risks and advise them to discuss any of these decisions with a medical professional or physician is a straightforward step in maintaining professional clarity. And this isn't to say peptides are bad, right? Some people are actually obtaining these from pharmacies as opposed to these random research sites. So for everyone listening, the goal isn't to create fear around peptides as a class of compounds. I personally am very interested in peptides, but it's to create an accurate picture of what the gray market actually delivers versus what it promises in marketing material. These are two very different things, and that's the gap where real risk lives, especially when you see people even trying to pop up with capsule-based peptides that they're selling on Amazon with limited data, no certificate of analysis, no HPLC process, and that's where we need to be concerned. When this is reaching mass market, people taking these things with limited education, limited research, and limited understanding of what makes the peptide safe. Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. If you enjoyed this show and the science that I shared here, please pay it forward and share this content with a friend. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy the audio content, leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps other people who are interested in these topics to find the content and make sure that the show is suggested in their feed. If you're on YouTube, hit that thumbs up button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. We do post video episodes on both YouTube and Spotify. So if you're just listening on audio right now and you maybe want to check out the videos in the future, make sure you check out those platforms as well. I appreciate you guys. And if you enjoyed the show, screenshot it, tag me in your stories. I'm at Sam Miller Science on just about every major platform. And I always appreciate the support as my team and I work to create new episodes for you each and every week. Thanks so much. And I'll talk to you in the next show. This show is designed to help you translate complex nutrition, fitness, and physiology concepts into leverage for your clients' goals or your own personal goals. This podcast is for online education, meaning this podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. And no doctor-patient or coach-client relationship is formed through listening to this episode. The use of information in this podcast and the show notes or the reliance on the information provided is done at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and is for educational purposes only. Always consult your physician before beginning any exercise program, and users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such condition. By accessing this podcast and any other episode, the listener acknowledges that the entire contents and design of this podcast are the property of Oracle Athletic Science and should not be used or retransmitted without permission of Oracle Athletic Science. This is protected under U.S. and international copyright and trademark laws. Except as where otherwise provided herein, users of this podcast may save and use the information contained in this podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without prior written permission of Oracle Athletic Science and Sam Miller, which may be requested through the contact information in the show notes. By accessing this podcast, the listener acknowledges that Oracle Athletic Science makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast, and coaches and listeners understand that this information may change over time with different research and anecdotal practices in the field. It is the listener's responsibility to stay up to date on this information. As always, this show is designed to help you, and I appreciate you listening to every episode. Simply understand it's for general informational and educational purposes, and we'll talk to you in the next episode.